Thank you very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that I can do justice to this very complex topic, but I'm sure that together we'll manage to cover some of the key developments in this process. What I have planned, let me see why I can't, okay, I'll go from here. What I've planned for the next 30-35 minutes is initially answer the question of what the maximum pressure, the US maximum pressure policy of the past almost 3 years has done to the Iranian economy. I will then try to address the question of whether the nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, is still alive, and if it's alive, then it can be sort of resumed. Then I will address the domestic politics in Tehran, because it's an important question of how ready Iran would be to return to the JCPOA, to full compliance. Same question in Washington: is the Biden administration in a position to rejoin the JCPOA, and if yes, how long will it take? There will be other geopolitical developments and generally other developments that we need to take into account when we want to ask what scenarios are possible over the next few months or over the course of the 2021. And I will then present 3 scenarios that I think are likely, and then try to gauge what the signposts and what the facilitators are. And then I will close with what I think international businesses and international companies interested in Iran or interested in topics around Iran should consider. So with that in mind, let's just jump into the economy. These are the indicators of 3 years. The left column is the last Iranian year, which ended in March 2020. The middle one is the current projections for the current Iranian year, and then the next one, the right one, is the next Iranian year. As you can see, I will actually share with you the two graphs as well. So as you can see, since the beginning of the maximum pressure, which sort of started hitting Iran in May 2018, Iran experienced 2 years of decline, 2018-19 and 2019-20, 2 years of decline. So over 2 years, the Iranian economy declined by about 12%, a bit more than 12%. But interestingly, even though the policy is still continuing, in the current Iranian year, which will end on the 20th of March, Iran is going to, the economy is going to grow marginally, very marginal, but still. So the process of economic decline stopped, even though the policy of maximum pressure is still in place. And actually a number of international organizations predict a growth of 3 or even more, 3% or more in the next Iranian year. There are other indicators, but I think the 2 indicators that will tell the story, one is inflation. So inflation was about 41% in the last Iranian year, has come down to about 30% this year, and will stay at that level for the next Iranian year, mainly because of the devaluation of the Iranian rial, which I will share with you in a minute. But also unemployment. Unemployment has been high in Iran because of demography. It improved slightly in the current Iranian year, mainly because of the growth of the non-oil economy in the country. And it will also stay around 10% in the next Iranian year. So the country has experienced what the economists call stagflation, so stagnation and inflation at the same time. But it's clear that it's moving out of that. It's important to understand because there are some forces, especially in the US, who say the Biden administration should take advantage of the leverage that it has gained over Iran as a result of the maximum pressure. The economic story is sad over the past 2 years, but it's not something that one can use as leverage anymore, because it's already coming out of that period of stagflation. So if we move to, there are two indicators that will tell us a bit more about the Iranian economy through the past 3 years. One is the exchange rate. So if we look at the situation with exchange rates, first of all, we realize how much the maximum pressure policy actually damaged the Iranian economy. The national currency lost about 70% of its value over the period of 3 years. But what's very interesting is how much the psychology of events, especially in Iran-US relations, played a role. You can see that the lowest value of the Iranian rial was in September and October of 2020, exactly around the time when a lot of commentators were predicting an October surprise, a potential US attack on Iran as a way of last sort of attempts to bring Iran to surrender and to sort of get the Iranians to agree with a new deal. Remember, this was the objective of the maximum pressure, to force Iran to come to the negotiating table and to negotiate about a new deal, even though there were lots of other objectives in between. But that objective was not achieved by the Trump administration. And then also the psychological war, which was being led against Iran, obviously had its impact. But it's very interesting that as soon as the first suggestions emerged that Trump may actually lose the election, and then when he lost the election, you can see how the Iranian rial regained in value. There was an initial hiccup while there were discussions whether the election would be certified or not. But since the certification of the election, and now obviously since the emergence of the Biden administration, the mood has moved towards a more optimistic outlook. The three lines you are seeing here, one is the so-called NEMA rate in Iran, the exporters versus importers rate, which is the red line. One is the free market rate, and one is what I have calculated as the inflation adjusted rate. I've put it there to show you that the current NEMA rate and free market rate are not that far away from the inflation adjusted rate. And I think this is where the Iranian rial will find a new balance if things move in the right direction. Obviously, we will discuss that. Let's look at the other important indicator, and that's oil production and oil exports. Obviously, an important contributor to government finances and also to hard currency revenues in the country. And that was obviously hard hit by the maximum pressure by US sanctions. I've included the level of production before the so-called Obama sanctions hit Iran in 2011. And back then, the total production of crude and condensate in Iran went down from about 4.2 million to about 3 million. But remember, back then there were waivers, and Iran could sustain a sort of 1 to 1.3 million barrels a day of exports. And then obviously when the JCPOA emerged and then was implemented, production and exports went up again with a peak in September 2017, when Iran even produced more than it was producing before the Obama sanctions. I'm showing this here because some people are wondering how quickly Iran could actually rehabilitate its production and its exports. Back then, there were lots of pessimists who were saying, no, it will take Iran years to recapture market share and produce oil. Well, in reality, it only took a couple of months after the implementation for Iran to hit new records in terms of production, but also in terms of export. But then obviously came the Trump sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions. And remember, initially, there were some waivers for 8 countries. So Iran reduced production, not at once, but over time. And then exports fell to a minimum after the waivers were not extended, and then production came down to about 2.5 million for a long time, and exports were initially 1 million, about below 1 million. The lowest was about 500,000 barrels a day, and now it's back to about 1 million barrels a day, which is mainly done through circumventing sanctions, going through third countries, loading crude oil ship to ship with putting trackers off. So it's really a very cumbersome approach, but Iran has maintained some market share, and obviously it can rehabilitate production and exports if the American government returns to the JCPOA. There is also a third bar in this chart, which is also important to also understand how Iran reacted to maximum pressure. And that's the export of petroleum products. Iran has increased its exports of petroleum products, even though it's generally negligible compared to the crude exports, but it is growing. So Iran is exporting potentially about 200,000 barrels of petroleum products a day. And it's important to see that as part of the Iranian response, because in response to maximum pressure, Iran has increased its domestic capacities, including domestic refining capacities. So Iran's refining capacity has gone from about 1.8 million barrels a day before the sanctions to about 2.2 million barrels a day now. And that is part of the story as well. So let's move on to just, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's important to understand how relations and the overall atmosphere around Iran in the region, in Iran-US relations, how they have been escalated over the past couple of years. Remember, maximum pressure started in May 2018. The first year, Iran actually remained fully committed to its commitments within the JCPOA. So between May 2018, when the US violated the JCPOA, and May 2019, Iran actually remained in full compliance. But then in May 2019, as a way of creating costs on the US, but also the other signatories, Iran started gradually withdrawing from its commitments. And that has continued, because this was the Iranian way of saying, if you do not fulfill your obligations, not just the US, but also the European side, because so many European investments, which would have been the upsides of the JCPOA for Iran, stopped as a result of US sanctions on third parties. So for a year or so, Iran escalated by gradually withdrawing from its commitments, but was still open to de-escalation. And that's why I've included the green boxes are attempts of de-escalation. You know, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from Japan was in Tehran to try to mediate. Mr. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, was invited to the G7 meeting in France. These were all attempts to maybe find a space for diplomacy. But when we focus on the last year, you see only escalation, which started in January 2020 with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani by the Americans. Then Iran also responding, but not necessarily pushing towards a military confrontation. But then many attempts of escalation, including sanctions, including a failed attempt by the Trump administration to not allow the UN arms embargo to be lifted on Iran. This was one of the first sort of important achievements of the JCPOA for Iran. From the day of signing of the JCPOA, it was planned that 5 years later, the UN arms embargo would be lifted on Iran. And it was actually an embarrassment to the Trump administration how lonely they were in the UN Security Council. None of the US allies accompanied the US attempts, and the UN arms embargo was actually lifted on Iran. And then I intentionally put there Pompeo's attempts, because I think after the election loss, it was mainly Mike Pompeo pushing for escalation with Iran and maybe positioning himself with some of the anti-Iran lobbies in the US or internationally. And then the last important event is the law that the Iranian parliament passed to escalate further, as a way of, in my view, as a way of creating an urgency for the Biden administration to think about the JCPOA, because, and this is important, the most important date we have to look at in the next month is the 21st of February, where if nothing happens, nothing positive happens for Iran, and I will come back to that, Iran would stop voluntarily implementing the so-called additional protocol, which will undermine the current monitoring system that the IAEA has in Iran, in inspecting Iranians and inspecting the Iranian nuclear program. So it's important to understand that there is a sense of urgency. I will come back to that. A couple of words here on this slide. China's imports of Iranian oil have been very interesting. If you look carefully, China has been importing as much oil and condensate as needed to facilitate the exports of Chinese goods, about $1 billion of Chinese exports to Iran. And if you see a phase of lower Chinese imports from Iran, it's related to the, again, corona-related or pandemic-related decline in exports or in Iranian imports from China. So it's a very interesting policy. And China has been importing oil and condensate both directly but also indirectly through Malaysia. And it's important to know that China is not necessarily following the US lead in terms of importing or sanctioning Iranian imports. Okay, a few words on the JCPOA itself. As I said, the plan of the Trump administration was to kill the JCPOA. The idea initially was Iran is going to come begging for a new deal, which obviously failed. And then towards the last months of the Trump administration, the main objective was to say, let's make sure that there is no deal that the Biden administration can return to. This is important to understand. Obviously, Biden can now return, or the Biden administration can return to the JCPOA because it's still there as a legal construct. So it has survived despite all the attempts to kill it, and obviously partly also because Iran has remained committed to some of the key elements, mainly the monitoring elements. Its cooperation and coordination with the IAEA has continued, and the Iranian strategy in these maximum pressure years can be described as strategic patience parallel to domestic capacity building. I mentioned the capacity building in the downstream sector, but you can also look at every other sector. Iran has had a lot of difficulties, but it has built capacities, and this is an important notion to understand later when we start thinking about, okay, what if the sanctions are lifted and European companies want to look at Iran again? You have to look very carefully to see how the needs of the country have changed as a result of capacity building. As I said, the JCPOA remains in place. It's important, and the IAEA inspectors are still supervising Iran's nuclear activities. But this could change on the 21st of February if nothing constructive happens, and that's an important date to keep in mind. Iran has been also very clear on what that step could be. It's important to understand, I mean, not just Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, but many of the top decision makers in Iran understand the politics and the challenges in Washington. They understand that the bureaucratic and legal process of lifting the sanctions may take longer, but they have indicated that all that it takes is an executive order by President Biden would state that the US is rejoining or returning to the JCPOA. In some statements from Iran, you may hear that all it takes is an executive order to comply with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is exactly the codification of the JCPOA inside the UN Security Council. Those who say this want to say, okay, if the US has complied, then we will think about whether we will allow, as from the Iranian side, we will allow the US to rejoin the JCPOA. So first they have to prove that they are willing to comply with the UN Security Council, which is exactly the same legal document. And then there will be a discussion. And this is part of the sequencing challenge that is the key issue. So you have two parties, both the Iranians and also the Biden administration, who are interested in a compliance for compliance, in a return to the JCPOA. But the key issue is sequencing. Who will take the first step, in what manner, and through what kind of a legal document? I will come back to that when I talk about domestic politics in both countries. So what's important, and this is part of the domestic picture in Iran, the Iranian government wants to see actions. So President Rouhani stated that very clearly. He said, if President Biden signs an executive order, we will also sign an executive order. If he makes a statement, we will also make a statement. But if he lifts sanctions, then we will start actions by realigning the nuclear activities with Iran's JCPOA commitments. The other signatories are also interested. Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese. In fact, yesterday, Mr. Zarif was in Moscow, and the Russians said very clearly that they expect the Americans to take the first step and to rejoin the JCPOA so that the JCPOA can be implemented again. So it's important to understand there. And in my personal view, the issue of sequencing, in fact, can be resolved by the other signatories, especially the Europeans. They could come in and they could sort of provide the type of space and the type of mechanisms that are needed to convince both sides that the other side will actually comply with the commitments. So let's focus for a couple of minutes on the domestic politics in Iran. Obviously, the big question is, will Tehran accept a return of the Americans and a full compliance within the JCPOA? The Iranian domestic politics, I've said it many times before, is mainly characterized by a continuous competition between different networks of power. I don't talk about factions anymore because there are so many different constructs and networks that are competing for power, and they coalesce and compete on a regular basis. Fact is that as a result of the maximum pressure and the changing security environment around Iran, the overall pendulum has moved towards the hardline networks. And you don't have to go far. You just look at the parliamentary elections in February 2020, and you realize that the hardliners are in a much better position. And usually we know that whenever there is a security or securitization of political developments in the country, hardliners find more space and more budgets and more access to power. And the society as a whole is also alienated and disinterested, and the low voter turnout usually turns into a hardline election victory. This is important to understand because we have presidential elections in June 2021, and that sort of will help us. This type of social mood will help us understand what is emerging there. One thing that's very important in Iran is that whenever the regime as a whole and the regime components have a sense of internal insecurity. They have a sense that there is there may be popular uprisings, or there may be initiatives against internal security. Then they become a lot more, they sort of escalate the external relations as a way of compensating for internal insecurity. The fact that there is no sense of internal insecurity is important, because that gives them a freer hand in external relations. The sense of external insecurity, which is a consequence of the maximum pressure over the past 3 years, can obviously be eased if the Biden administration returns to the JCPOA and some of the sanctions and pressure are lifted. So this is where it's important. What is important is that there will be, as I said, presidential elections in June 2021. And if nothing happens, nothing positive happens in terms of improving economic conditions, lifting sanctions, lifting some of the other restrictions, then we can all talk about a hardline victory in the June 2021 elections. And then most probably we'll have to have another briefing talking about the consequences of that. But today, let's focus on whether it is acceptable and feasible to actually return to the JCPOA, which could theoretically generate some positive results. And we already saw some of the positive results when we looked at the exchange rates, when we looked at the performance in oil production and oil exports. One of the key factors that determine the Iranian decision on the JCPOA and other issues is obviously the Supreme Leader's Ayatollah Khamenei's perspective. And it's very important. Too many less informed analysts are running around and saying Khamenei wants a hardliner or a Revolutionary Guards commander to be the next president. It's completely inaccurate. And the reason is this. It wouldn't be the first time that the hardliners would be controlling all the different branches of power. Don't forget, when Ahmadinejad became president, the Iranian parliament was in the hands of hardliners, and the judiciary was automatically in the hands of the hardliners since decades ago. Khamenei has seen this. Khamenei has seen the situation where all the branches of power are controlled by the hardliners, and that Ahmadinejad era became a major headache for the Supreme Leader. So I don't think he's now hoping to have another hardline controlled sort of political environment, which would become a challenge. That's why he has now more and more opted to state that he would like to see someone from the younger generation to be the next president. And a younger figure can obviously break some of these factional sort of molds that many have created in Iran, and could theoretically also change some of the political dynamics. If we have time in the question and answer, we can come back to the issue of presidential candidates. It's too early, but we can start with some speculations. The society as a whole, as I mentioned earlier, is very dissatisfied and frustrated. We should not forget the Iranian society was hoping for economic and social improvements after the JCPOA, and it never really got to enjoy that period of growth and economic prosperity because of Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA. So there is a lot of alienation, frustration, but there is no mood. I know that this is one of the questions. There is no mood for a revolutionary upheaval. That's why also I said earlier that the regime as a whole is not concerned about internal security. I think some of it may be also caused by the pandemic. Obviously, we have also a lot of negative consequences of the pandemic, but there is no those who are sitting outside and saying if we put some pressure on Iran, there will be a revolution and the regime will be gone, are completely mistaken. However, the regime as a whole has always been interested in a high voter turnout. If nothing major happens between now and June, voter turnout will be low, and most probably a sort of regime loyal hardline person could be elected. But if something positive happens, and this is what the regime as a whole wants, there could be a new dynamics, and we can obviously watch what's happening. There will be a higher voter turnout if there is a genuine choice between the candidates, and that's why one has to wait for the final list of candidates by the so-called Guardian Council. The hardliners in Iran who won the Majlis elections last year and would love to win the presidential election this year, they are very worried right now. They are worried because they know that if the Biden administration and Iran return to the JCPOA, sanctions are lifted, and there is an economic boost, it can change the popular dynamics. It can change the voter turnout. It can change perception about the moderates, Hassan Rouhani and his team, and it could change the outcome of the election. So that's why expect a lot of what I call spoiling activity from the hardliners. And you have seen some of them, whether it's arresting another dual citizen, whether it's executing someone without the sort of due process. These types of initiatives will emerge because they would love to delay this process, and they would love to postpone a potential Iran-US dialogue to after the elections. Very quick look at the domestic dynamics in Washington. Just checking the time. Okay. And it's important to understand, I mean, you all know very well, the Biden administration is facing a lot of challenges, domestic and foreign policy, and it would be a mistake to think that Iran is, or the JCPOA is one of their priorities right now, but it's definitely something that has occupied some of the strategies in Washington, and there are also lots of opponents. A lot of people are telling the Biden administration that Biden or his government should use the leverage gained through the Trump or through the maximum pressure and ask Iran for a lot more than just the JCPOA, which would be a non-starter. Now, if we say that the various appointments are an indication, then I think the Biden administration is preparing to talk to Iran. Key people like Tony Blinken, who was confirmed yesterday, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, even John Kerry, a number of others, Rob Malley, these are all people who have had direct interactions with the Iranians. This is important because this is always the first barrier to any type of engagement. Do the people know each other? Do they trust each other? Have they had interactions before? And this is obviously there in this case. And in my view, and others can comment, but in my view, the key individuals in the Biden administration know that if you really are serious about achieving something larger with Iran, discussing other topics, Middle East security, missiles and others, the first step would be to rejoining the JCPOA, because if you don't, then you have already lost credibility and there would be no space for other discussions. There were also interesting quotes from Tony Blinken's Senate hearing when he was talking in, I think it was on the 19th of January. I'm not going to read this to you, but it's important, it's interesting to understand there is interest, there is an understanding that it will be important and that diplomatic engagement will be important, but also an understanding that there will be areas, non-JCPOA related areas, whether it's human rights or missiles and so on, where there will be tensions that will have to be managed. So there is a tension in the Biden administration. But as I said, it's also clear that a compliance for compliance would be the right first step. So the concern, in my view, within the Biden administration is not rejoining the JCPOA, it's how to design the next stage, the next process of engagement, talking about other issues, maybe looking at some of the faults of the current deal, the nuclear deal and so on. So in my view, there is interest, there is complexity. And obviously, the next step would be President Biden consulting with the European allies. And I hear that he has already talked to Angela Merkel and then to see how the next steps could be structured. And as I said, these European allies especially will be important in managing the sequencing. And we will come back when we look at the scenarios. Very quickly, some other developments. Iran has started looking at the Financial Action Task Force legislation, which had been more or less suspended over the past couple of years. When the maximum pressure started, the Iranians didn't feel incentivized to look at this. The fact that they have restarted the process of passing legislation and enacting legislation is a sign that Iran is optimistic about that sanctions being lifted. There is, when we look at the region, the geopolitical developments in the region, there's a genuine confusion everywhere. You know, there are so many factors, pandemic, US withdrawals from the region, Russian, Chinese strategies, Turkish strategies. There are so many factors that are confusing everyone. And now comes to it a potential US return to the JCPOA. And that obviously mainly unsettles the adversaries of Iran, whether it's Israel and or Saudi Arabia and others. And it's important to watch those players and how their relationship with Iran will change. Israel has already said that it may attack Iran if Biden returns to the JCPOA. We have heard this now for decades. The Israelis have always talked about the possibility of war, so that they compel especially Western powers to focus on pressure on Iran to prevent a war. But it's a tired strategy, and I think if anyone understands that, the Biden team will do. So I think this is not going to deter the Biden administration from engaging Iran. So the situation is fluid, and there are lots of uncertainties. But I think all of these uncertainties are not going to deter the main process, which is, as I said, a return to compliance for compliance. And whoever doubts this, go back and read all of the comments and statements from the adversaries during the actual nuclear negotiations, 2014, 2015. And then obviously we all know that the JCPOA was signed, was implemented, and it actually worked. And everyone said that this was actually a success. There is also some suggestion that the Biden administration may integrate its policy towards Iran in a larger Middle East strategy. We will have to wait and see, but I think returning to the JCPOA could be a first step, because it could also reconfirm that a multilateral approach to some of the issues, whether it's missiles, whether it's regional security, could actually be the way to go forward, and maybe to create new multilateral fora where some of these issues could be discussed, including players from the Middle East. So with all of that, let's look at the scenarios. Obviously, you have heard the key scenario. I have said it a number of times. For me, the key scenario is a return to compliance for compliance. Signpost would be very soon Biden signing this executive order that I mentioned earlier. That would be a very strong signpost that there is a desire to do this and to do this fast. And there would also be signposts if we hear that the European powers, signatories of the JCPOA, are trying to address the issue of sequencing. If they come up with some ideas, imagine President Biden making a statement parallel to his executive order saying the US is not going to object to the $5 billion IMF loan to Iran. And then the Europeans coming forward and saying, we support it and we are going to support the implementation of this in terms of transacting money and so on. What facilitates this scenario is obviously the presence of all the different players. It's not a coincidence that the Iranian ambassador to the UN, Mr. Takhtravanchi, has written an op-ed in the New York Times, I think published yesterday, where he says, well, we are waiting for the next US move. Well, Takhtravanchi is not only a senior diplomat, he was also part of the nuclear negotiations. So you can imagine contacts are there. And then the other facilitators is there is opportunity for de-escalation, for example, through prisoner releases or through other gestures. I mentioned the IMF loan and so on. So I think this is a realistic scenario. I'm not saying this will solve all the other issues, but it could be a scenario which obviously then would lead to the lifting of the US secondary sanctions. There is a second scenario where the Biden administration sort of de-escalates with Iran, stops some of the pressure, but is not in a hurry to return to the JCPOA. Maybe waiting for the next Iranian government, maybe waiting for a framework where a new deal could be negotiated. That could also happen. So in that case, there will be some rhetoric or de-escalation, but no executive order, no sort of fast moves towards returning to the JCPOA, and then weighing the different scenarios. This would happen, and the facilitator for this would be that the anti-Iran Democrats, the Iran hawks, would sort of convince the Biden team, the Biden administration, that they should use the leverage against Iran and get more concessions from Iran. I can tell you now that it would be a non-starter. It's not going to lead to good results. It's going to further push Iran towards a hardline faction or hardline scenarios, and then obviously also bring about a president that will be probably less friendly towards engagement with the US. But this could also happen, and obviously the Iranian hardliners from the other side could also contribute by doing things that will upset the US directly or the US allies in the region. A third scenario is also thinkable, that there would be no change. I mean, the sort of continuous confrontation or confrontational mode, because the two sides cannot agree on sequencing, or because there are too many accusations against Iran. And then basically a continuation of this coercive strategy towards Iran, maybe not as harsh as the Trump administration, but still no space for new engagement and a return to the JCPOA. In my view, these three scenarios, I mean, the likelihood of these three scenarios, I think the first one is the more likely scenario. The second one is also not very unlikely. The third one would be extremely unlikely, in my view, unless something completely unexpected happens. I mean, some action where Iran can be accused as anti-American or anti-Israeli, and that also explains why the Trump administration tried so hard to compel Iran to do something before the handover of the government, so that they could justify a harsher action or make it more difficult for Biden to return. Anyhow, if considering these scenarios, considering that I personally believe that the compliance for compliance is a possible scenario, what does it mean for the international business? If it happens, then we can see the lifting of the US secondary sanctions by April 2021. Some of this time will be needed because of the bureaucratic processes in OFAC and so on, but roughly by April 2021. This would obviously open the Iranian market to international companies. Some were present before, some are interested now. It's interesting how the shifts in Iran have brought about new companies who are interested. This again doesn't mean that all the problems will disappear. Iran still will be a challenging environment, challenging market, but at least some of the sanctions that were difficult for companies will disappear. Iran, as I said, also will quickly rehabilitate its production, oil and gas production, and exports. I think by June, July, they could sort of go back to a much higher level of export, though it will take a while till they are back at 2.3, 2.5 million barrels of exports. if the compliance for compliance is not achieved before Iran's elections, the conditions for business will not improve in 2021, because then everyone will wait for the result of the Iranian elections. There will be new faces, there will be new attempts, and so much can go wrong. So if it doesn't happen within the next month, the executive order from Biden, then it's safe to say it will be very difficult to achieve anything positive in 2021. No matter, this is important to understand, no matter which scenario takes place, we have to live with the fact that the RRGC, the Revolutionary Guards and their affiliated companies are becoming more and more dominant in Iran. Also part of the consequence of the maximum pressure is that there has been more space for RRGC companies. So those who say, no, I will wait for non-RRGC companies to play a more important role, they will wait very long and not achieve that. One has to just live with this fact. If there is no thaw in the Iran-US relations, Iran will increasingly continue dealing with China and Russia as the main strategic partners. It was not a coincidence. If you look at the current diplomatic tour that Zarif is taking, he went to the Republic of Azerbaijan, Russia, Armenia, Georgia, and Turkey. These are some of the key partners in the sanction scenario, if nothing happens. And Russian and Turkish companies will be important, and hence potentially platforms for cooperation. Iran's domestic capacity building, as I mentioned, has changed the market. There is a lot more domestic production. There is a completely different orientation. There is domestic production with export orientation. So trade orientation, trade realities and investment realities have changed. And if things improve and you're looking at re-entering the market, look at the market carefully. Don't think you're going back to how it was in 2016. I'll stop here and wait for your comments or questions.